Hi, welcome back. We just got done talking about National Allied slash Nicholson Publishing slash More Fun Inc. Yes, Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson is now cooking 3 sets of books to keep those comic books afloat. Now let's swing back and examine Comics Magazine Company a little longer. As far back as the first issue of Comics Magazine, the term funny pages was present on the editorial page. By the second issue, it still says Comics Magazine on the cover, but it now says funny pages below in the larger font. By the third issue, the indicia inside the book still calls it Comics Magazine, but with funny pages in parentheses. And these are the issues we'll be going over today, from before the title officially changes to Funny Pages in 1937. The editorial page of Comics Magazine, Funny Pages in parentheses number 3, is dedicated to the 500,000 people who will peruse the pages of this magazine. Now, that statement is not the same thing as legal postal sales data and is likely hyperbole. However, when we can finally start talking about postal sales data when we get to 1937, the earliest year we have sales figures for, we'll find a flagship title like Famous Funnies was selling 350,000 to 500,000 plus copies a month, so this number of 500,000 is certainly in the realm of possibility. Comic book companies would kill to have sales numbers like this today, but even back then, at a dime an issue, a 500,000 sold copies wasn't going to make you rich. When you're paying the printers, you're paying the creative staff, though not as much as you're paying the printers, etc., etc. So what were they hoping for in 1936? What did they see as the end goal? A million copies? No one was probably expecting comic books to ever sell a million copies a month in 1936. Why do I say this? Only one newspaper in the entire country had sales figures that good per daily, weekly issue. Granted, Sunday newspapers did have better sales figures than the weekly dailies, and multiple newspapers sold more than a million Sunday copies. But for days in the week, only the New York Daily News pulled in numbers like that. A 500,000 copies was better than the New York Times was pulling in. Those are very respectable numbers, anywhere near a 500,000. So if it wasn't from sales, where was the money?
Merchandising.
Merchandising? What's that?
Merchandising. Come, I'll show you. Open up the store. Come, walk this way. Take a look. We put the picture's name on everything.
This was a truism in
Merchandising.
1987 when Spaceballs came out. It's true now, and it was true in 1937. The goal, or at least the one that got you rich, was to come up with a property so popular as to attract licensing deals. And I've alluded to this multiple times before in regards to comic strips. This is where the money for Buck Rogers, Little Orphan Annie, and Popeye really came from. So let's examine Comics Magazine funny pages in parentheses in this context. How close were they to having a bankable character? Probably wasn't anyone from the further adventures of Jane and Johnny. Captain Jim of the Texas Rangers is an old man, and while lots of popular comic strip characters were grown ups, almost none of the popular ones were old. Jane and Johnny are ciphers, indistinguishable from each other, except that Jane is the one in a dress. They might have thought they'd have a hit with Dickie Duck. Dickie Duck predates Looney Tunes' Daffy Duck by a year, so he is more likely modeled after Donald Duck, a Disney character who has already appeared in a whopping 11 cartoons and is immensely popular. Dickie Duck in his stories is always poor and hungry, something that might have resonated with readers during the Great Depression. He got the front cover on issue number 3, though never again. There is Skipper Ham Shanks, a character I talked about in episode 16. Skipper and his friends are all millionaires now after recovering the sunken treasure, but Sultan Sourpuss is raising a small army to fight them and steal the money. Gaining and losing fortunes was a common theme in Popeye's Thimble Theater, which this feature still resembles enough to become popular? Maybe they expected great things from the sapphire eye of Sekhmet. It's an adventure serial where a bookish historian discovers writings about an Egyptian tomb containing a sapphire cut in such a way that it can be used like an X-ray machine to look through and to see things, and he's just gotta have it. Mr. Murray brings his almost full-grown children, Jimmy and Dory, as they cross the Atlantic, and during the crossing receive the first warning to stay away from the tomb when a knife is left in their cabin door. Luckily, Jimmy, who looks like he's 13 or 14, is a Pep Morgan-like star athlete because there are going to be dangers ahead. The Sapphire Eye is the first published artwork of Ken Ernst. Ken was just a teenager when he drew this, which might explain why it's not really more than okay art. By 1939, while attending art school in Chicago, his pencils will tighten up and he'll have his own style. I reprinted one of his Gabby Flynn stories in one of my own reprint comic books. He will continue with Comics Magazine to its new owners when it becomes Centaur Comics, and wind up at Harvey Comics, where he'll stay until 1949 when he retires from comic books. The author is this guy you might have heard of, Will Eisner. Will is also just a teenager at this point, and this is one of two of his earliest published comic book stories. This same month, he gets a one-page installment of Billy Hayes' Modern Pirate printed in the British comic book Wow, What a Magazine #1, the artwork of which and the writing and artwork as a package were being done in America and then shipped to England. Will go on to do many things like the celebrated newspaper feature The Spirit and inventing the graphic novel. I won't go into too much now. Maybe I'll have to do a creator spotlight or two on him at some point in the future. But there is a reason the comic book version of the Oscars or the Emmys is named after him. No, none of these is what Comics Magazine thought of as their star material, though. While Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson was sure pulp adventure fiction was the secret to comic book success, Cook and Mahan of Comics Magazine had another idea. They thought that instead of promoting a character, they would promote a format. Starting with the second issue of Comics Magazine, the book would feature, in addition to the serialized stories in 1 to 4 page installments like all other comic books, they would begin featuring a 7-page complete story. And this was a big deal. If this is your first episode and you're coming to this from a modern perspective, thinking, well, what's the deal? 7 pages? I mean, I normally get trade paperbacks and it's a complete story in over 100 pages. Well, go back and listen to my first 19 episodes of this, and you'll get a sense of how unusual that is. So if I'm George T. Delacorte Jr. of Dell Comics, the managing editor, and I look at the latest issue of Comics Magazine and I flip through and I see a 7-page installment of something of a character I've never heard of, and I'll call Comics Magazine up and say, I have the license to Little Orphan Annie, the most popular comic strip character in the world, and I'm only giving her 4 pages, and you're telling me that you want to dedicate twice that much real estate in the book to a character that no one's ever heard of, that no one is ever going to see again. Are you insane? Because that is crazy. Spoiler alert, longer narrative form wins out, but we're not there yet. We'll come to it. Anyways, the very first 7-page story, Tom Cooper's The Golden Idol, started with a 1-page introduction explaining just what's happening here. This story is told entirely in pictures and records a new departure in narrative form. And they know this is a gamble as the page ends with a call for much needed feedback. Do you want more stories told in this fashion? The first installment was an adventure story. In issue number 3, W.M. Allison, the artist from the Further Adventures of Jane and Johnny, gives us a complete Western story, Frontier Justice. With this issue, the 1-page introduction includes the question left unasked the first time, what kind of stories do you want? In issue number 4, we go back to adventure fiction with Klondike Gold, drawn by Victor Dowling, an amateurish artist who Comics Magazine must have liked because he was good at deadlines or something, because they will publish a lot of his work. Dowling will also work for Atlas Comics in the 1950s before retiring from comics in 1955. In issue number five's introduction, the question of what do you want is expanded with examples. Do you want adventure, detective, western? Those are very important questions because Comics Magazine is thinking about expanding. But we're not there yet either, and there's going to be a lot more to discuss in upcoming episodes. So stay tuned, and bye for now.